Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A story written under moonlight. Let's begin.
Prologue: The Quiet One. Karl Myers learned early that silence was safer. In lecture halls packed with hundreds of students, his presence should have been forgettable. Another face hunched over a notebook, another pen moving steadily across lined paper. Cassel College wasn't small by any means, but it wasn't large enough to swallow someone whole either. With fewer than 10,000 students roaming its brick paths and ivy-covered buildings, patterns formed quickly. People noticed who stood out, and Karl, despite doing everything he could to blend in, stood out anyway. Straight A's, perfect attendance, never late, never absent, always seated near the front, not because he craved attention, but because he liked to hear the professor clearly. He spoke only when called on, and when he did, his answers were precise, concise, correct. No extra words wasted. No opinions volunteered. The quiet one, people whispered. First, it was harmless. Curious glances, polite smiles. Then came the looks that lingered too long, the murmurs that carried pity instead of interest. Poor thing. Does he even have friends? He looks like he needs help. Karl hated those looks more than outright mockery. At least mockery was honest. He kept his head down and reminded himself that college was temporary. For years, maybe less if he pushed harder. He could endure 4 years. He always endured. What he hadn't anticipated, what no amount of preparation could have accounted for, was Jake Blackwood. Jake was everything Karl wasn't. Captain of the Cassel College basketball team. Broad-shouldered, loud, magnetic. He laughed easily, spoke with confidence, and moved like the world made space for him automatically. Professors knew his name. Students orbited him. Girls adored him, guys admired him or feared him. And somehow, inexplicably, Jake noticed Karl. Started small. A shoulder bump in the hallway, just hard enough to make Karl stumble but not enough to draw attention. A careless foot stretched out during class, catching Karl's ankle as he passed. Snickers from Jake's friends. Jake's lazy grin. Karl told himself it was nothing. Coincidence. Accidents. Then came the frog. He still remembered the sound, wet and panicked, as the locker door swung open. The thing leapt out, slapping against his arm before hitting the floor. Someone screamed. Laughter erupted behind him. Karl froze. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. He stared at the frog as it hopped frantically across the corridor tiles, his hands trembling at his sides. "Relax, Myers," Jake's voice drawled from behind him. "It's not poisonous." The hallway erupted into laughter again. Karl said nothing. He crouched, picked up his fallen books, and walked away as if his hands weren't shaking, as if his chest didn't feel like it was caving in. Jake watched him go, brow furrowing just slightly. That was the first time irritation flickered beneath his amusement. The second incident was the gym clothes. Karl didn't notice until he reached into his locker after class, fingers brushing against empty metal shelves. He stood there longer than necessary, staring, as if the clothes might materialize if he waited. He ended up borrowing a spare shirt 2 sizes too big, his ears burning as whispers followed him across the gym floor. Jake leaned against the bleachers, spinning a basketball on one finger. "Lose something?" he asked casually. Karl met his gaze for half a second, just long enough to confirm what he already knew. "Yes," Karl replied quietly. That was it. One word. No accusation. No anger. Jake's jaw tightened. By the third time, his backpack dangling mockingly from the basketball hoop like a trophy, Jake was no longer amused. He was confused. Karl stood beneath the hoop, staring up at his bag. The zipper gaped slightly, notebooks peeking out like exposed ribs. Someone had tied the straps together, looped them just out of reach. "Ah, come on." One of Jake's teammates laughed. "Aren't you gonna say something this time?" Karl exhaled slowly. "It's fine," he told himself. "It's always fine." He fetched a chair, climbed carefully, and retrieved his bag without a word. When he stepped down, he smoothed the fabric of his sweater, adjusted his glasses, and offered the small, practice smile he'd perfected over the years. The smile that said, "I'm okay." The smile that said, "You didn't hurt me." Jake hated that smile. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance. It was worse, acceptance. What kind of person didn't react to being humiliated? Jake found himself watching Carl more closely after that. The way he walked, careful, deliberate. The way his shoulders tensed whenever laughter rose too suddenly nearby. The way his expression barely changed, like a mask worn too long. It didn't make sense. Everyone snapped eventually. Everyone broke. So why hadn't Carl? Jake started pushing harder. Not because Carl deserved it, not because it was funny anymore, but because something about that calm unsettled him. Because the quiet felt like a challenge. Look at me, Jake thought. React. Do something. But Carl never did. He swallowed every slight, absorbed every jab, until they sank so deep they became invisible to everyone else. Everyone except Jake. And somewhere between the irritation and the curiosity, between the need to provoke and the need to understand, a dangerous question began to form in Jake Blackwood's mind. When will Carl Myers finally snap? And more importantly, what would happen when he did? Chapter 1: Collision Course. Carl Myers liked mornings best when the campus was still half asleep. Cassel College at 7 a.m. was quieter, gentler. The brick pathways were damp with dew, lampposts humming softly as they flickered off one by one. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and coffee drifting from the student cafe that would soon be overcrowded. At this hour, there were no eyes lingering too long, no laughter that cut too sharp, just the sound of his shoes against the pavement and the steady rhythm of his breathing. He adjusted the strap of his backpack on his shoulder and reminded himself, like he did every morning, that today would pass. Today would end. All he had to do was make it through. Carl was good at endurance. Inside the main lecture hall, he took his usual seat near the front, third row from the aisle. He liked routines. Familiarity gave him something solid to hold onto when everything else felt fragile. He set his notebook down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the desk, pen placed parallel to the spiral binding. Focus, he told himself. The murmur of voices grew as students filtered in, shoes scuffing, chairs scraping. Carl stared at the blank page, letting the noise blur into something distant and manageable. Then the room shifted. He felt it before he saw it. The subtle change in energy, the way conversations spiked a little louder, laughter sharper. Jake Blackwood had entered. Carl didn't look up. He never did. Looking only made things worse. Jake's presence was impossible to miss anyway. He moved like he belonged everywhere he stepped, broad shoulders brushing past desks without apology. Someone clapped him on the back. Someone else tossed him a grin. The basketball team gathered around him in the row behind Carl, voices low but animated. "Game Friday," one of them said. "We're gonna destroy them," another laughed. Carl's pen tightened between his fingers. Ignore it, he thought. You're invisible if you don't react. A shadow loomed over his desk. "Hey, Myers." Carl's stomach sank. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head just enough to acknowledge the voice. Jake leaned over the back of the chair beside him, forearms resting casually, dark eyes bright with amusement. "Yes," Carl replied quietly. Jake tilted his head, studying him like a puzzle he hadn't solved yet. "You ready for the midterm? Or are you gonna make the rest of us look bad again?" A few chuckles rippled behind them. Carl swallowed. "I just study. Right?" Jake smirked. "Must be nice not having a life." Carl's ears burned, but his expression barely changed. He offered the small, practiced smile, the one that had gotten him through years of this. "I suppose." Jake straightened slowly, his grin faltering for just a split second. That was it? No protest, no embarrassment, just calm. Jake scoffed and turned away, but irritation curled low in his chest. He slid into his seat, jaw tightening. What is wrong with him? Jake thought. The professor entered, and the lecture began. Carl focused fiercely on the board, copying notes with precise care. But his heart refused to slow. The echo of Jake's voice lingered, threading itself into his thoughts. "You gonna make the rest of us look bad again?" He didn't want to stand out. He never had. Being good at school wasn't a flex. It was survival. Knowledge didn't leave bruises. Answers didn't yell. Halfway through the lecture, the professor posed a question. A heavy pause filled the room. Carl already knew the answer. He always did. He kept his gaze lowered, hoping someone else would speak. No one did. "Mr. Myers?" the professor prompted. A dozen eyes turned toward him. Carl inhaled slowly and raised his head. The theory suggests that social behavior adapts under prolonged stress, altering both individual and group dynamics. "Exactly," the professor said approvingly. "Well done." A ripple of whispers followed. Jake watched Carl from behind, his expression unreadable. There was something about the way Carl spoke. Not timid, not arrogant. Just sure. Like he trusted facts more than people. Jake felt an unfamiliar twinge in his chest. Not admiration. Definitely not that. Something closer to annoyance. Why doesn't he crumble? Jake wondered. When the lecture ended, Carl packed his things quickly, keeping his movements controlled. He could feel eyes on him, could always feel them, but he didn't let it show. As he stood, a foot suddenly slid into his path. Carl stumbled, barely catching himself on the desk. His notebook slipped from his grasp, pages fluttering to the floor. Laughter erupted. "Oh, my bad," Jake said lazily, though he made no move to help. "You okay there, Myers?" Carl crouched to gather his papers, fingers trembling. He forced his breathing steady. "Don't react. Don't give them what they want." "Yes," he said softly. "I'm fine." Jake's brows furrowed. Carl stood, nodded once, and walked away. The irritation in Jake's chest flared into something sharper. The library was Carl's refuge. Tall shelves rose like walls, heavy with the comforting weight of books. The air was cool, hushed, wrapped in the soft rustle of turning pages and distant footsteps. Carl settled into his favorite corner desk near the window, sunlight filtering in pale and gentle. Here he could breathe. He opened his notebook but found himself staring at the page, words blurring. His hands shook as he set the pen down. It shouldn't matter, he told himself. You've dealt with worse. But college was supposed to be different. A fresh start. Somewhere he could just exist. Carl pressed his fingers to his temple, willing the tightness there to ease. A sudden wave of dizziness hit him. His vision darkened at the edges, the library tilting unnaturally. He gripped the edge of the desk, breath coming shallow. "Not now," he pleaded silently. "Please, not now." The noise around him faded into a dull hum. His heart pounded erratically, each beat loud and wrong. His chest felt too tight, like the air had thickened. Carl stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. A few heads turned. Panic surged higher. Bathroom, he thought. Just get to the bathroom. He stumbled through the aisles, ignoring the curious glances, and pushed into the restroom. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing him in. Carl locked himself into a stall and slid down against the wall, hugging his knees to his chest. His breathing broke. Tears came quietly, hot and unwelcome. He pressed his hand over his mouth, shoulders shaking as he struggled to stay silent. "You're fine," he told himself over and over. "You're fine. This will pass." It always did. Eventually, his breath slowed. The world steadied. Carl wiped his face with the sleeve of his sweater and stared at the floor until the last tremor faded. When he finally emerged, eyes red but dry, he washed his hands carefully, avoiding his reflection. He didn't see the figure standing just outside the door. Jake hadn't meant to follow him. At least, that's what he told himself. He'd left the lecture hall still simmering, irritation buzzing under his skin. Practice wasn't for another hour. He wandered campus aimlessly, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, thoughts circling back, annoyingly, to Carl Myers. The way he didn't flinch, the way he didn't fight back. It wasn't normal. When Jake spotted Carl heading toward the library, something compelled him to trail behind, staying just far enough away not to be noticed. "I just want to see what he does," Jake rationalized. "What his deal is." He watched Carl disappear into the library. Minutes passed. then more. Jake paced near the entrance, glancing toward the doors. A weird knot formed in his stomach. When Carl finally stumbled out of the restroom, pale and shaken, Jake froze. Carl looked broken. Not dramatically, quietly, like something precious cracked where no one could see. Jake's chest tightened. Carl didn't notice him. He walked past, gaze fixed on the floor, shoulders drawn inward. Jake stood there long after Carl disappeared down the hall. For the first time since he'd set his sights on the quiet kid, Jake Blackwood felt something dangerously close to guilt. That night, Carl lay awake in his dorm room, staring at the ceiling as moonlight traced faint lines across it. His roommate was out, probably partying. The room was silent, too silent. Carl replayed the day in his mind, each moment looping relentlessly. Jake's voice, the laughter, the way his body had betrayed him in the library. I can't keep doing this, he thought, heart heavy. But what was the alternative? He rolled onto his side, clutching his pillow, and closed his eyes. Across campus, Jake sat alone in his apartment, basketball forgotten by the door. He stared at nothing, Carl's face haunting him. That fragile moment, those tears. Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. What the hell is wrong with me? He muttered. Neither of them slept well that night. And somewhere between silence and regret, something irreversible had begun. Chapter 2: Cracks in the Armor. Carl slept in fragments. He drifted in and out of shallow rest, thoughts looping relentlessly behind his closed eyes. Every time he began to sink, something yanked him back. Jake's voice, the scrape of laughter, the sensation of the world narrowing until his chest couldn't expand properly. By the time dawn crept through the thin gap in his curtains, Carl had already given up on sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks he'd memorized months ago. His body felt heavy, exhausted in a way that sleep never seemed to touch. His mind, on the other hand, was painfully alert. You should have said something, it whispered. You should have stopped him. You let this happen. Carl squeezed his eyes shut. I did what I had to, he murmured to the empty room. Silence didn't answer back. He eventually forced himself up, going through the motions on autopilot: shower, clothes, coffee he barely tasted. He caught his reflection briefly in the mirror. Dark circles under his eyes, mouth drawn tight. He looked small. Carl turned away before the thought could settle too deeply. Jake noticed the rumors before he noticed Carl again. He was halfway through breakfast with his teammates, half listening as they argued about plays, when a voice from the next table drifted over. Did you hear about that Myers guy? Someone whispered. Jake stiffened without meaning to. Apparently he fainted in the library yesterday, another replied. Stress-induced or something. Figures. A third scoffed. Guys always wound too tight. Jake's fork clinked sharply against his plate. Shut up, he snapped. The table went quiet. What? One of his teammates asked, startled. You're the one always. I said shut up. Jake pushed back from the table, appetite gone. He grabbed his jacket and left without another word, pulse thudding uncomfortably loud in his ears. Fainted, he thought. Stress-induced. The image from yesterday replayed unbidden. Carl stumbling out of the bathroom, face pale, eyes glassy. Jake had brushed it off at the time, telling himself it wasn't his problem. Now the knot in his stomach tightened. It is, something inside him insisted. You made it your problem. Jake shook his head and kept walking. Carl skipped his first class. He told himself it was just this once, that he needed the extra hour to breathe, to steady himself before stepping back into a space full of eyes and whispers. He curled up at his desk instead, knees tucked in, laptop open but untouched. His thoughts spiraled anyway. What if it happens again? What if you lose control in public? What if they see? He hated that most of all, not the bullying, not even the fear, but the possibility of being seen as fragile, weak, broken. Carl pressed his fingers into his palms until the sting grounded him. I'm okay, he whispered, though the words felt thin. By the time he headed to the library later that morning, his nerves were stretched taut. Jake didn't mean to go there. He told himself he needed to study, that the library was quiet, neutral ground. But as soon as he stepped inside, his gaze scanned the room automatically. Carl was there. Of course he was. He sat at his usual desk near the window, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped together as he stared at the screen in front of him. He hadn't noticed Jake yet. For a moment, Jake just watched. Carl wasn't smiling. There was no mask today. His face looked drawn, eyes distant, like he was bracing himself against something invisible. Jake swallowed. He turned away sharply and headed for the stacks, heart beating faster than it should have. Stop staring, he told himself. You're not a creep. But even as he pulled a random book from the shelf, his attention kept drifting back. Minutes passed. Then Carl stood abruptly, chair scraping softly against the floor. Jake glanced up just in time to see him weave slightly before catching himself on the desk. Jake's breath hitched. Carl hurried away toward the restrooms, head down. Without thinking, Jake followed. The bathroom was quiet, fluorescent lights humming faintly. Jake stopped just outside, hesitating. This is stupid, he thought. Go back. Then he heard it. Not sobbing. Not even a sound, really. Just the faint, broken rhythm of someone trying very hard not to cry. Jake froze. His chest tightened painfully as he stood there, rooted to the spot, listening. He'd heard people cry before, loud, messy, attention-seeking. This was different. This was someone falling apart in pieces too small for anyone else to notice. The door creaked softly. Carl stepped out, eyes red-rimmed, cheeks damp. He looked up, and their gazes collided. Time seemed to slow. Carl's breath caught sharply, shame flaring across his features. His shoulders drew in instinctively, like he wanted to disappear into himself. Jake didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't speak. For once, there was nothing clever or cruel to say. They stared at each other, the air between them thick and fragile. Carl's eyes flickered with something raw, anger, embarrassment, hurt, all tangled together. Jake saw it then. Not weakness, pain. Something inside him cracked. Carl looked away first. He brushed past Jake without a word, moving quickly down the hall. Jake remained frozen, heart pounding. I did this, he realized, the thought landing heavy and undeniable. I did this to him. Carl didn't stop walking until he reached the far end of campus. His chest burned, humiliation coiling tight in his stomach. Of all the people, of all the moments, Jake had to see him like that. He pressed his hands to his face, breathing hard. Get it together, he scolded himself. You let him see. You gave him exactly what he wanted. But even as the thought formed, it felt wrong. Jake hadn't looked victorious. He'd looked shaken. The realization unsettled Carl more than the tears had. Jake skipped practice that afternoon. He sat alone in his apartment instead, staring at the wall as guilt churned restlessly inside him. Every memory replayed with new clarity: the frog, the locker, the backpack hanging from the hoop. At the time, it had felt harmless. Funny. A way to prove dominance, to poke at someone who never fought back. Now it felt cruel. Jake exhaled sharply, pressing his palms to his eyes. I didn't mean to. The excuse died in his throat. Intent didn't matter. Impact did. For the first time, Jake wondered what it would feel like to be on the other side of his attention. To be watched, targeted, broken down slowly until silence felt like the only defense. The thought made his stomach twist. The next day, the tension on campus felt different. Carl noticed the whispers less, not because they'd stopped, but because his mind was elsewhere, on the image of Jake's face in the bathroom. That look of something dangerously close to remorse. He didn't know what to do with it. Jake noticed something too. He noticed how often Carl flinched at sudden noise, how he avoided crowded spaces, how his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. And for the first time, Jake didn't feel powerful noticing it. He felt responsible. The announcement came during Carl's afternoon lecture. The dean stood at the front, hands clasped, smiling in that carefully neutral way administrators perfected. As part of our interdisciplinary initiative, she began, all second-year students will be assigned a mandatory group project, pairing individuals from different departments. A collective groan rippled through the hall. Carl's stomach sank. Groups will be posted online by the end of the day, the dean continued. This project is non-negotiable and will account for a significant portion of your final grade. Jake shifted in his seat, unease prickling at the back of his neck. Something about this felt ominous. When the list went live later that evening, both of them stared at their screens in stunned silence. Myers, Carl, psychology. Blackwood, Jake, kinesiology. Assigned together. Carl's breath caught painfully in his chest. Jake's heart dropped. Neither of them knew yet whether this was punishment, chance, or the beginning of something neither was ready to face. But one thing was certain, there would be no more distance to hide behind. Chapter 3, Forced Proximity. Carl stared at the project assignment on his screen long after the letters stopped meaning anything. Myers, Carl, psychology. Blackwood, Jake, kinesiology. His pulse thudded unevenly, like his body hadn't quite decided whether to panic or shut down. Of all the people, of all the possible pairings, Cassel College had thousands of students, thousands, and yet, he closed his laptop with a soft click and pressed his palms flat against the desk. It's fine, he told himself, the familiar mantra sliding into place. It's just a project. You don't have to trust him. You just have to finish. Still, the idea of being alone with Jake, of long hours, shared space, conversation, made his chest tighten. Across campus, Jake was having a much louder internal crisis. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, refreshing the page like it might change if he stared hard enough. Didn't. Carl Myers. Of course it was Carl Myers. Jake leaned back in his chair, dragging a hand down his face. His first instinct was frustration, sharp and instinctive. This was going to be awkward, uncomfortable, probably miserable. Then the memory of the library bathroom surfaced uninvited. The red-rimmed eyes. The way Carl had looked at him like he'd been caught doing something unforgivable. Jake swallowed. "This is your chance," something inside him said. To what? He snapped back mentally. Make it worse? He exhaled slowly. At the very least, he couldn't be a jerk. He owed Carl that much. They met 3 days later. Carl suggested the library, neutral ground, public enough to feel safe. Jake agreed immediately, relief flickering across his face at not having to negotiate the location. Carl arrived 10 minutes early as usual. He chose a table near the back, close to the windows but far enough from the main aisles to avoid foot traffic. He laid out his notes methodically, each page carefully organized. Boundaries, he reminded himself. Be clear. Be calm. When Jake finally appeared, he hesitated just inside Carl's line of sight, shifting his weight awkwardly. Jake said. "Hey!" Carl looked up. For a brief moment, they just stared at each other, memories hanging thick in the air between them. "Hello," Carl replied evenly. Jake cleared his throat. Is this seat taken?" "No," Carl said. "You can sit." Jake lowered himself into the chair across from him, movements careful in a way that would have seemed ridiculous to anyone who knew him. He rested his elbows on the table, then immediately pulled them back, like he wasn't sure what was allowed anymore. "So," Jake began, forcing a grin that didn't quite land. "Guess we're partners." Carl inclined his head. "It appears so." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing. Jake shifted. "I was thinking we could, split the workload evenly. Like, I'd prefer if we outlined expectations first," Carl interrupted gently. Jake blinked. "Oh, yeah, sure." Carl folded his hands together, posture straight but not stiff. "I want to be clear. I'm willing to work with you professionally. That means respecting my time and my space. No jokes. No comments unrelated to the project." Jake nodded quickly. "Yeah, of course." "And," Carl added, meeting his gaze steadily, "if at any point this becomes uncomfortable for me, I will leave and contact the professor." The words weren't sharp. They weren't angry. They were firm. Jake swallowed. "I get it," he said quietly. "That's fair." Carl felt something loosen in his chest. Good, he thought. You did it. You spoke. They turned their attention to the project guidelines, falling into a cautious rhythm. Jake was surprisingly attentive, asking questions, taking notes. Carl explained the psychological framework, outlining theories with practiced clarity. Jake listened, really listened. He found himself leaning forward, eyes following Carl's hands as he gestured subtly, voice steady and confident when he spoke about his field. "You really know your stuff," Jake said without thinking. Carl paused, pen hovering above the page. "Thank you," he replied after a moment. The compliment lingered between them, unexpected and fragile. They spent the next few weeks like that. Long afternoons in the library, occasional evenings in empty classrooms when they needed access to presentation equipment. The work was demanding, the hours longer than Carl would have chosen, but manageable. Jake tried awkwardly to act normal. Too normal. He overcorrected constantly. If Carl dropped his pen, Jake jumped to pick it up, only to freeze halfway, unsure if that was crossing a line. He avoided teasing entirely, his jokes stumbling into uncomfortable silence. Carl noticed. It was strange. Jake was quieter now, less domineering. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his tone was careful. Carl remained distant, polite to the point of formality. He answered questions, shared ideas, but never volunteered more than necessary. He didn't meet Jake's eyes for long, didn't smile unless the situation demanded it. But something subtle began to change. Jake started noticing things. The way Carl's mouth twitched when he found something amusing, like he was trying not to smile too wide. The dry humor slipped into his comments when he felt safe enough to let it surface. "That theory assumes everyone responds logically under stress," Carl said once, arching an eyebrow. "Which is optimistic." Jake snorted before he could stop himself. Carl glanced up, startled, then, to Jake's surprise, huffed out a quiet laugh. It was small, barely there, but it hit Jake like a punch to the chest. He laughs, Jake thought stupidly. He actually laughs. The realization unsettled him. The incident happened on a Thursday afternoon. They were working in a shared study space, Carl explaining a section of their presentation while Jake typed. A group of students nearby, two guys from Jake's team and a girl Carl vaguely recognized from one of his lectures, were whispering loudly. "Is that him?" One of the guys muttered. "Yeah, the quiet freak," the other snickered. "Always looks like he's about to cry." Carl's shoulders tensed. Jake felt it instantly, like a shift in the air. "Maybe if he loosened up," the girl added. "He wouldn't be so." "That's enough." The words were out of Jake's mouth before he'd fully processed them. The group went silent, staring. Jake stood, chair scraping loudly. "You've got something to say. Say it somewhere else." One of the guys scoffed. "Chill, man. We're just joking." "No," Jake said flatly. "You're being assholes." Carl stared at him, heart racing. The group muttered among themselves before retreating, casting annoyed looks over their shoulders. Jake sat back down slowly, hands shaking just a little. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. "I shouldn't have." "Thank you," Carl interrupted. Jake looked up. Carl's gaze was steady, something resolute shining through his usual reserve. "I appreciate you speaking up." Jake nodded, throat tight. For the rest of the session, the dynamic felt different. Less brittle, less guarded. Later, as they packed up, Jake spoke again. "You know," he said, hesitating, "you don't have to put up with that. From anyone." Carl paused, backpack slung over one shoulder. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm learning that." Jake watched him leave, a strange warmth settling in his chest. Their first genuine conversation happened by accident. They were taking a break outside, sitting on the steps beneath the fading afternoon sun. Carl sipped his coffee slowly, eyes fixed on the quad. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said. Carl stiffened but nodded. "As long as it's relevant." Jake winced. "Fair. Why psychology?" Carl considered him for a long moment. "Because," he said finally, "understanding people makes them less frightening." Jake blinked. "That honest?" he asked. Carl shrugged. You asked. Jake let out a soft breath. Yeah, I guess I did. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't press as hard as it used to. You ever think about standing up to people more? Jake asked carefully. Carl's jaw tightened. Every day. Jake glanced at him. Then why don't you? Carl's fingers curled around his cup. Because surviving quietly kept me safe once. Unlearning that takes time. Jake nodded slowly. I think, he said, voice rougher than he expected. You're stronger than you think. Carl looked at him, then really looked at him. And I think, Carl replied evenly, that people can change if they choose to. The words landed like a challenge. The night before their next meeting, Jake overheard voices outside the gym lockers. Bet Myers still freaks out easy. Someone laughed. Yeah, we should mess with him again. Old times sake. Jake's blood ran cold. He stepped forward without hesitation. Touch him, Jake said, voice low and dangerous. And you're done. The laughter died instantly. Jake stood there, fists clenched, heart pounding. He didn't realize it yet. But in that moment, he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. And Carl Myers was no longer alone. Chapter 4, The Breaking Point. Carl found out the next morning. He hadn't been looking for the information. He wasn't the type to linger near locker rooms or listen for rumors. But Cassel College had a way of letting things slip through cracks no matter how carefully you walked. He was waiting outside his afternoon lecture when two students passed behind him, voices careless. Blackwood lost it, one said. Yeah, over Myers of all people. Guess even the golden boy has a conscience. Carl's fingers tightened around the strap of his bag. They didn't notice him. They didn't stop talking. Heard he shut that prank down hard. Told them to back off or else. Carl felt something twist sharply in his chest. Jake stopped it. The thought didn't bring relief the way it probably should have. Instead, it stirred something heavier. Unease, confusion, and a familiar bitterness that crept up like a bruise being pressed too hard. He didn't turn around. He didn't ask questions. He simply walked away. Jake noticed immediately when Carl didn't acknowledge him that afternoon. They met in their usual library corner. Jake arrived first this time, restless energy buzzing under his skin. He kept replaying the night before. The way his teammates' laughter had died. The shock on their faces when he'd stepped in. I did the right thing, he told himself. Carl arrived exactly on time, nodded once in greeting and sat down. No smile. No eye contact. Just distance. Jake swallowed. Hey! Hello! Carl replied, voice neutral. They worked in silence for a while. Carl spoke only when necessary, his words clipped, efficient. He didn't thank Jake. Didn't mention the incident at all. The omission weighed on Jake like a stone. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Do you? Jake started, then stopped. Cleared his throat. Do you know about yesterday? Carl didn't look up from his notes. Yes. Jake's chest tightened. And you're not gonna? No, Carl said quietly. The word landed harder than any insult. Jake stared at him. No what? No comment. No reaction. No gratitude, Carl said, still not meeting his eyes. I didn't ask you to intervene. Jake flinched. I wasn't expecting. I just thought. That's the problem, Carl interrupted gently. And that gentleness hurt more than anger would have. You thought. You didn't ask. Jake's jaw tightened. I was trying to help. I know, Carl said. And I don't doubt your intent. He finally looked up then, eyes steady but cold. But intent doesn't erase history. The silence that followed was brittle, stretched tight. Jake leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Okay, he said slowly. Then, let me say what I should have said a long time ago. Carl's pulse quickened. I'm sorry. The words were plain. No humor. No excuses. Carl didn't respond. Jake pressed on, voice roughening. I'm sorry for the shit I did to you. For the jokes. The pranks. For making your life harder just because I could. Carl's chest felt too tight to breathe properly. Jake met his gaze fully now. I was an asshole. I know that. Something inside Carl snapped. Not loudly. Not violently. It broke open. Do you? Carl asked softly. Jake hesitated. Do you really understand what you did? Carl pressed, voice trembling just slightly. Or do you just understand that you feel bad now? Jake's mouth opened, then closed. Carl stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. Do you have any idea? He continued, words spilling out faster now. What it's like to wake up every morning already bracing for humiliation? To calculate every step, every word, every breath because someone like you might be bored that day. Jake's chest constricted. You didn't just make jokes, Carl said. His voice shook, but he didn't stop. You taught me to be afraid of existing. You turned classrooms into minefields. You took places that were supposed to be safe and poisoned them. Jake felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. I thought, Carl went on, blinking rapidly, that if I stayed quiet enough, invisible enough, it would stop. That if I didn't react, you'd lose interest. A humorless laugh escaped him. You didn't. You escalated. Tears welled despite his efforts to hold them back. And the worst part? Carl whispered. It worked. I disappeared. I learned how to shrink so well that even now, when you apologize, I don't know how to exist outside of that version of myself. Jake couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. Carl's hands curled into fists at his sides. So no, he said hoarsely. I don't thank you for stopping one prank, because I'm still undoing years of damage. Silence swallowed the space between them. Carl's shoulders finally sagged, the fight draining out of him all at once. He dragged a hand over his face, voice breaking completely. I was never your rival, he said. I was never your equal. I was just convenient. Jake's eyes burned. I didn't know, he whispered. Carl laughed softly, bitterly. That doesn't make it better. Jake stood then, slowly, carefully, like any sudden movement might shatter what little remained intact. I won't defend myself, he said. There's nothing to defend. He swallowed hard. You're right. What I did wasn't harmless. It was cruel. The words seemed to cost him something. Carl sank back into his chair, shaking. Jake stayed standing, fists clenched, forcing himself not to reach out. I don't expect forgiveness, Jake continued, and I know I don't deserve it, but I needed you to hear that I see it now. All of it. Carl pressed his fingers to his eyes, breath hitching. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Carl straightened, expression composed with visible effort. I've requested a reassignment, he said quietly. Jake felt the words hit him like a blow. You what? I emailed the professor this morning, Carl replied. I asked to be moved to another group. The room felt suddenly too small. I can't keep doing this, Carl said. Working with you, talking to you. It's reopening things I barely managed to close. Jake nodded numbly. I get it. I don't want to hate you, Carl added. But I need space to heal. And right now, you're too close. Jake forced himself to meet his eyes. Okay. The simplicity of the response nearly undid him. Carl stood, gathering his things with practiced precision. This project, he said, pausing, was the first time I spoke back. That matters to me. It should, Jake said hoarsely. Carl hesitated, then nodded once and walked away. Jake remained there long after he was gone, devastation settling heavy in his chest. I lost him, he thought, and for the first time the loss felt deserved. Chapter 5 Redemption isn't loud. Change didn't arrive with apologies or grand gestures. Came quietly. Carl noticed it first in absence. Jake Blackwood stopped sitting with his teammates in the lecture halls. The familiar cluster of loud laughter behind Carl dissolved, replaced by scattered students and empty seats. Jake took a spot near the aisle instead, notebook open, attention forward. He didn't look back. Carl told himself not to notice. He noticed anyway. After the reassignment request, the professor had granted Carl a temporary solo extension while they evaluated alternatives. It meant fewer forced interactions, fewer reasons to cross paths. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt unsettled. Carl moved through his days cautiously, like someone testing a floor that had collapsed once before. His anxiety didn't vanish, but it softened at the edges. He slept a little better. His chest didn't tighten quite as fast. And Jake changed in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't looking. It happened in the student union first. Carl sat alone at a corner table, headphones in, coffee cooling between his hands. He wasn't listening to anything. The music was just a shield. Across the room, a group of students laughed loudly. "Dude, you remember that Myers kid?" Someone snorted. "Yeah. Freaked out over nothing. Not funny." The voice cut through the noise cleanly. Carl's breath hitched. Jake stood near the counter, posture relaxed but eyes sharp. The conversation stuttered to a halt. "I said it's not funny," Jake repeated. "Find something else to talk about." One of the guys scoffed. "What, you his bodyguard now?" Jake didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile. "I'm someone who's done pretending this crap is okay." The silence that followed was thick. Carl stared into his coffee, heart pounding. He didn't look up. He didn't thank Jake. But something inside him shifted. Jake stopped going to most team hangouts after that. He still showed up to practice, still played with the same intensity, but when the locker room filled with offhand cruelty and casual mockery, he didn't laugh along. He left early. He stopped replying to group chats. Some people noticed. "You've been acting weird," one of his teammates said one night. "What's with you lately?" Jake toweled sweat from his neck, expression unreadable. "Just tired." "Tired of what?" Jake met his gaze evenly. "Of being that guy." The teammate frowned. "Man, don't go soft on us." Jake didn't respond. He grabbed his bag and walked out. He didn't feel lighter afterward, but he felt honest. Carl watched all of this from a distance. He saw Jake sit alone more often, saw the way conversations quieted when he passed. Not out of reverence, but discomfort. He saw Jake correct a professor once, gently but firmly, when Carl's name was mispronounced. Carl pretended not to hear. He didn't know what to do with the conflicting emotions blooming in his chest. Trust was fragile. Longing was dangerous. He told himself admiration didn't mean forgiveness, that noticing didn't mean excusing. Still, on a rainy afternoon, when Carl ducked into the campus cafe to escape the weather, he found Jake already there. Their eyes met across the room. Carl froze. Jake looked just as startled. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Jake did something unexpected. He nodded once, polite, distant, and turned back to the counter. No approach, no apology, no attempt to close the space Carl had asked for. Carl exhaled slowly. He ordered his drink and chose a table near the window. The rain blurred the world into soft gray streaks. He wrapped his hands around the warm cup, grounding himself. A few minutes later, Jake passed by with his own coffee. He hesitated. "Mind if I sit?" he asked quietly. "If not, that's okay." Carl studied him. Jake's posture was open, but restrained. No pressure in his eyes, just patience. "You can sit," Carl said after a moment. Jake took the chair across from him, leaving a respectful distance between their cups. They didn't speak. The silence was different this time. Not sharp, not tense, just shared. Carl watched the rain slide down the glass. Jake stared into his coffee like it might confess something. Minutes passed. "I won't stay long," Jake said finally. "I just wanted to say, I hope you're doing okay." Carl's throat tightened. "I am," he replied. "More than before." Jake nodded. "Good." Another pause. "I meant what I said," Jake added. "About not deserving forgiveness." Carl glanced at him. Jake's gaze remained lowered. "I'm not doing this to earn anything," Jake continued. "I just don't want to be that person anymore." Carl absorbed the words slowly. "Change doesn't erase the past," he said. "I know," Jake replied, "but I'm hoping it can shape the future." Carl said nothing, but he didn't leave. That night, Carl lay awake again. But this time, his thoughts weren't spiraling. They were conflicted. People can change, he reminded himself. He'd said it to Jake once, almost as a test. Now he wondered if he was watching it happen. The thought scared him, because if Jake truly changed, then Carl would have to confront something harder than anger. Hope. Weeks passed. The reassignment still hadn't gone through. Carl worked independently, checking in with the professor. Jake never asked about the project. Never pushed. Instead, he showed up when it mattered. When a classmate mocked Carl's presentation voice, Jake shut it down. When someone tried to exclude Carl from a study group, Jake redirected the conversation without making a scene. When rumors surfaced again, Jake cut them off at the source. Always quiet, always firm. Carl noticed the toll it took. Jake's social circle shrank. His smiles became rarer, more real when they appeared. He looked tired but resolute. Carl felt something ache in his chest. The confession happened on an evening neither of them had planned. They crossed paths near the library steps just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the campus in warm gold. "Hey," Jake said softly. "Hi," Carl replied. They stood there, uncertain. "I was going to head home," Jake said. "But, do you want coffee?" Carl hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." They walked together in comfortable silence. Inside the cafe, they sat at the same table as before. "I know you asked for space," Jake said carefully. "So tell me if this crosses a line." Carl shook his head. "You're fine." Jake exhaled. "There's something I need to say," he continued. "Not because you owe me anything. Not because I expect an answer." Carl's heart began to race. Jake met his gaze fully now, vulnerability naked in his eyes. "I'm falling for you," he said simply. The words hung between them, quiet, unadorned. Carl's breath caught. Jake didn't move closer, didn't reach out. "I don't need you to feel the same," Jake added. "And I won't ask you to. I just didn't want to lie to you anymore." Carl stared at him, emotions crashing in waves. Fear, longing, anger, something dangerously close to tenderness. "I don't know what to do with that," Carl admitted, voice trembling. "That's okay," Jake said. "You don't have to." They sat there, coffee cooling, hearts exposed. Outside, the campus lights flickered on one by one. And for the first time, Carl wondered, not without fear, but not without hope, what healing might look like if he didn't walk away. Chapter 6. When Silence Speaks Back. The night air carried a hush that felt intentional. Carl noticed it as he stepped out of the library, the doors closing softly behind him. Campus at this hour, just past 10, felt like a secret version of itself. The crowds were gone. The laughter had thinned into echoes. Lamplight pooled on the brick walkways like something warm and waiting. He adjusted his bag on his shoulder and exhaled. He hadn't planned to stay late. He rarely did anymore. But tonight, concentration had come easier than usual, thoughts aligning instead of scattering. It felt like progress.it also felt dangerous. "Hey!" Carl turned. Jake stood a few steps away, hands in his jacket pockets, posture relaxed but careful, as if he were constantly measuring how much space to take up. "I didn't think you'd still be here," Jake said. "I could say the same," Carl replied. Jake smiled faintly. Practice ran long. They stood there, the quiet wrapping around them. Carl noticed how natural it felt now. Not effortless, but no longer strained. "Do you want to walk?" Jake asked. "No destination, just around." Carl hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." They fell into step together, shoes tapping softly against stone. The lampposts illuminated Jake in pieces. Hands, jawline, the tired set of his shoulders. Carl's chest tightened. "This is real," he thought. "And that scares you." They walked without speaking for several minutes. Carl found himself listening to the small sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic beyond campus gates. It grounded him, kept his thoughts from spiraling. Eventually, Jake broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot," he said quietly. Carl glanced at him. About how people see me." Jake huffed a soft laugh. "And how much of that I built on purpose." Carl considered that. "You mean the persona?" Jake nodded. "The athlete. The guy who's always confident. Always winning. He looked ahead, eyes reflecting the lamplight. I thought if I kept that up, no one would look too closely. Carl felt something stir. Recognition, sharp and familiar. And if they didn't look closely, Jake continued, they wouldn't see how scared I actually was. Carl slowed his steps slightly. Scared of what? He asked. Jake swallowed. Failing. Disappointing everyone. Being ordinary. The word tasted bitter in his mouth. All my life, people told me I was special, Jake said. That I had talent, potential. And every time I messed up, even a little, it felt like proof that I was wasting it. He laughed softly, humorless. So I made sure no one ever saw me hesitate. Carl stopped walking. Jake did too, turning to face him. I hurt you, Jake said, voice rough, because it was easier to feel powerful than to feel afraid. Carl's heart pounded. The honesty in Jake's eyes stripped away any defense Carl might have reached for. I didn't know how to exist without that version of myself, Jake admitted. And when you didn't react, when you didn't play the role I expected, it made me angry. Because you were solid. Quiet, but solid. Carl inhaled shakily. He saw me, he realized. Even then, they resumed walking, slower now. They reached the edge of the quad, where a wide lawn stretched under the night sky. The campus lights cast long shadows, the stars faint but present. Carl sat on one of the low stone walls bordering the grass. Jake followed, leaving a careful distance. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Carl did. I learned to stay silent because noise was dangerous, he said. Jake's head turned toward him immediately. My parents fought, Carl continued, eyes fixed on the grass. A lot, loudly. I learned that speaking up just made things worse. That staying quiet meant fewer consequences. His fingers curled together in his lap. At school, it was the same. The less I reacted, the faster people lost interest. Jake's chest tightened painfully. So silence became armor, Jake said. Carl nodded. And a cage. The words trembled as they left him. I don't know who I am without it, Carl confessed. I'm afraid that if I stop being careful, everything will fall apart. Jake shifted closer, not touching, but near enough that Carl felt the warmth of his presence. I don't think you're fragile, Jake said. I think you survived by adapting. That's strength, even if it doesn't look loud. Carl laughed softly. You really don't do subtle compliments, do you? Jake smiled. I'm learning. The quiet stretched again, but this time it felt full instead of empty. Carl's hand rested on the stone beside him, fingers brushing the cool surface. Without fully deciding to, he let his hand drift closer. Their knuckles brushed. Jake froze. Carl's heart hammered, fear flaring bright and sharp. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he let his fingers curl, tentative, around Jake's hand. Jake inhaled sharply. Carl, he whispered. I know, Carl said softly. If this is too much. It's not, Jake said immediately. Then, gentler. It's just everything. Jake's fingers tightened around Carl's, warm and grounding. The contact sent a quiet thrill through Carl's chest. Not overwhelming, not consuming, just real. They sat like that, hands entwined, the campus breathing around them. Jake turned slightly, gaze flicking to Carl's face. May I? He asked. Carl met his eyes, searching. The question wasn't just about a kiss. It was about trust. Yes, Carl said, voice barely above a breath. Jake leaned in slowly, giving Carl time to pull away. When their lips met, it was soft, hesitant, careful. No urgency, no demand, just a promise. Carl's eyes fluttered shut as warmth spread through him, something gentle and astonishing blooming in his chest. He kissed back, tentative but present, letting himself feel. When they parted, Jake rested his forehead lightly against Carl's. Thank you, Jake murmured. For what? Carl asked. For choosing to stay. Carl swallowed. He didn't answer right away. Later that night, alone in his room, Carl lay staring at the ceiling again. But this time, the thoughts that surfaced weren't sharp. They were quiet questions, fragile and hopeful. Am I strong enough to trust happiness? The question lingered, unanswered, but no longer impossible. Chapter 7: What Healing Looks Like. Spring arrived quietly. Carl noticed it first in the trees lining the main quad, buds unfurling with cautious optimism. The air softened, warming just enough to make lingering outside feel intentional instead of endured. Students sprawled on the grass between classes. Laughter carried farther now, less sharp. It had been 2 months since the night under the campus lights. 2 months since Carl had asked himself if he was strong enough to trust happiness. He still didn't have a definitive answer, but he was learning. Jake's change wasn't dramatic. It never became a performance. He kept his distance when Carl needed it, stayed close when Carl invited it. He didn't announce his growth or seek validation for it. He simply showed up again and again in small, consistent ways. When someone interrupted Carl in class, Jake waited. When Carl spoke again, Jake met his eyes and nodded, subtle encouragement. When a professor dismissed Carl's comment too quickly, Jake raised a hand and redirected the discussion back without making it about himself. When rumors tried to reform, they died early deaths. Jake Blackwood had become a quiet presence. Carl found that oddly comforting. They spent time together, but not constantly. Coffee between classes, late walks once or twice a week, study sessions where they worked side by side, the silence companionable instead of strained. They didn't rush anything. Sometimes Carl caught Jake watching him. Not intensely, not possessively, but with something like awe. Those moments still made Carl's chest flutter with fear and something sweeter underneath it. Careful, he reminded himself. But don't disappear. The forum was announced in mid-April. An open college discussion on student well-being, academic pressure, and campus culture. Attendance was optional. Participation even more so. Carl almost didn't go. He read the email twice, heart pounding, finger hovering over the delete key. Forums meant speaking. Speaking meant being seen. But something inside him, quiet, steady, refused to let it go. He thought of the version of himself from months ago. The one who stayed silent because it was safer. The one who endured instead of lived. He thought of Jake, sitting beside him in the cafe, not asking for forgiveness, not asking for anything at all. Carl clicked attend. The auditorium buzzed with low conversation the evening of the forum. Chairs filled slowly, students and faculty mingling with cautious interest. Carl chose a seat near the middle, not front, not back. Jake arrived a few minutes later. He spotted Carl immediately and headed his way, but stopped 2 rows back instead of sitting beside him. Carl glanced over his shoulder, surprised. Jake shrugged slightly, a silent question. Is this okay? Carl considered it, then nodded. Jake smiled softly and took his seat, hands folding loosely in his lap. The panel began. Topics flowed from academic burnout to social hierarchies, from mental health resources to unspoken expectations. A few brave students spoke. Others listened. Carl listened too at first. Then the words started to resonate too deeply. A girl talked about feeling invisible unless she excelled. A guy admitted he stayed silent because it was easier than challenging popular opinion. Carl's heart beat faster with every shared truth. You're not alone, something inside him whispered. His hand trembled as he raised it. The moderator noticed immediately. Yes. Carl stood. The room felt suddenly enormous. He swallowed, pulse roaring in his ears. For a fleeting moment, panic surged, the old instinct to sit back down, to disappear. Then he breathed. My name is Carl Myers, he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. And I think we underestimate how much silence costs. The room quieted. Carl continued, grounding himself in the cadence of his words. Some of us stay quiet because we're afraid. Some because we're taught that speaking up makes things worse. And sometimes, silence works. It keeps you safe. He paused, gathering courage. But survival isn't the same as living. Jake watched from the crowd, heart lodged in his throat. Carl stood straighter. When cruelty is ignored, it doesn't disappear. It settles. Teaches people like me to shrink. And it teaches others that power doesn't need accountability. A murmur rippled through the audience. I'm learning, Carl said, voice firm now, that being quiet doesn't mean being weak, but choosing to speak, even when it's terrifying, is how we change things. He exhaled slowly. I don't want Cassel to be a place where silence is mistaken for consent, or where kindness is optional. When he sat down, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was genuine. Jake didn't clap loudly. He didn't stand. He simply met Carl's gaze across the rows and smiled. Proud, grounded, steady. Carl smiled back. Not practiced. Real. They walked together afterward, campus lights glowing soft and gold. You were incredible, Jake said quietly. Carl huffed a breathless laugh. I thought I was going to throw up. You didn't, Jake replied. You spoke. Carl glanced at him. You stayed back. I wanted you to have the space, Jake said. This was yours. Something warm settled in Carl's chest. They stopped near the same path Carl used to take every morning, the one he'd once walked alone, head down, bracing for the day. Jake shifted, hands in his pockets. Can I ask you something? Carl nodded. Jake smiled. What are we? The question was gentle. No pressure in it. Carl considered the night air, the distant laughter, the steady presence beside him. I don't want to rush into labels, Carl said honestly. I'm still figuring myself out. Jake nodded immediately. Me too. But, Carl added, meeting his eyes, I want this, whatever this is. Slowly. Honestly. Jake's breath shuddered. That's more than enough. Carl hesitated, then reached for Jake's hand. This time, there was no fear in the motion. They stood like that for a moment, the world moving gently around them. Weeks later, Carl walked across campus with a lighter step. Nothing about Cassel College had changed structurally. The buildings were the same, the paths familiar, but Carl was different. He no longer hugged the edges of hallways. He met people's eyes. He spoke when he had something to say, and sometimes even when his voice shook. Jake walked beside him. Not in front, not behind, just there. Carl caught his reflection in a window as they passed. He was smiling, and this time it wasn't armor. It was joy. Silence had never been weakness. It had been survival. And love, patient, quiet, earned, had taught him how to speak.
Thank you for listening Under the Same Moon. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're always welcome here. Good night.